Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I wanted to welcome you to the Distinguished Lecture in Global Security at Rowan University. Today's session promises an insightful exploration into the global security implications of the Israel-Hamas war, led by our esteemed guest speaker, Aaron David Miller. Aaron Miller, a distinguished diplomat and scholar, serves as a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. With a career spanning over 4 decades, Mr. Miller has been a pivotal figure in the shaping the U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East. His extensive tenure at the State Department, spanning from 1978 to 2003, saw him play various roles, including historian, analyst, negotiator, and advisor to multiple secretaries of state from both Republican and Democratic administrations. Mr. Miller's contributions to diplomacy are profound, notably his role in formulating U.S. policy on the Middle East and the Arab-Israeli peace process. His insights, drawn from years of firsthand experience, have been disseminated through 5 published books, including his most recent work, The End of Greatness: Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. Aaron Miller's expertise is widely sought after, making him a frequent commentator in esteemed publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Foreign Affairs, as well as on major news networks including CNN, MSNBC, and NPR. We are incredibly fortunate to have him here with us today. And then joining us after the talk as moderator is my colleague, Dr. Joshua Gedacht, an esteemed scholar whose research delves into the historical narratives of the modern Middle East. Dr. Gedacht's expertise enriches our discussion today, providing valuable context to the complexities of the region. So without further ado, let us delve into the profound insights of Aaron David Miller as we examine the global security ramifications of the Israel-Hamas war. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Miller and Dr. Gedacht.
Carla, thanks so much. I can call you doctor, even though I don't refer to myself that way, and Josh, doctor as well. It's an honor and privilege for me to be here and to be part of this series of distinguished lectures in and on global security. I want to also thank Dr. Lawrence Markowitz and the Department of Education for supporting and funding this series. We've got about 45 minutes. So I do want to leave time for Q&A. I want to make 6 basic observations, but before I do, I want to share with you 3 additional insights which have governed me. I'm not here to sell you anything. My selling days are over. You can agree with these, you can disagree with them, we can talk honestly and openly and civilly about them. But these 3 observations I think are really important for you to understand where I'm coming from, and also as grounding in trying to understand and explain what an effective U.S. foreign policy would mean. First is the issue of geography. If you want to understand why America behaves the way it does abroad, the point of departure, in my view, is our physical location. We are the only great power in the history of the world that is sandwiched between 2 non-predatory powers, toward north and south, and literally fish to our east and west. What one historian, I wish it had been me, described as our liquid assets. These 2 oceans and these 2 non-predatory powers have created a situation where, with some exceptions, the British did burn much of Washington in the early 19th century. We've never been occupied, we've never been invaded as a country. In fact, it has been a very long time, since the late 18th century, when we were 4 million, including 400,000 Black slaves, perched precariously on the eastern seaboard, where we had the great powers of the day, the British, the French, and the Spanish, literally in our own backyard. Since that time, I would argue, we've had a degree of physical security unprecedented and unparalleled, and beyond that, that is enjoyed by any of the powers, the adversaries and the allies and friends with which we deal abroad. And this geographic advantage, and it is an advantage, I wouldn't trade it, but I think it's produced several attributes which continue to characterize our foreign policy. Number one is our arrogance. We have a margin for error that no country with which we deal enjoys. we can make all kinds of mistakes in the projection of American military power, diplomatic power, economic power abroad without threatening the physical security or political integrity of the country. There are very few countries throughout history that could make such a claim. Number two, I think it explains our naivete. We may once have been influenced and affected by the threat of invasion or occupation. But since the late 18th century, we have freed ourselves to a degree that is humanly possible from the two forces that govern small nations and even large ones who have physical security vulnerabilities. And I think that's an incredibly important attribute because in large part, I think it prevents us, maybe intellectually we understand what it's like for the small power, but I'm not sure emotionally we really grasp the threats and the vulnerabilities that small powers enjoy and that we have been able to transcend. And finally, I think where we are explains our optimism. There is a darker side to the American story, no doubt. But we are and have been throughout most of our history, a nation that has been able to renew, to re-energize, to enlighten, and essentially produce, with all of its imperfections and all of our transgressions, an extraordinary political system. The only one, I would argue, in history based on an idea. And that's very special. It makes us exceptional as a nation. And when I say exceptional, I don't mean in this sense better or superior. I mean that our history and our geography is unique. And as a consequence of the fact that we don't face immediate threats, we've been able to think beyond the issue of security. More on that in a minute. Second, let's be clear about domestic politics. Every administration has them. They are a part and parcel of foreign policy. They cannot somehow, in a democratic polity, however imperfect this one is, you can't insulate foreign policy or the national interest from the issue of domestic politics. However, I think that if you wanted to look at American foreign policy and have a chance of succeeding, the line that you draw would not be between left and right, not between liberal and conservative, not between Democratic and Republican. It would be between dumb on one hand and smart on the other. And the only thing that matters is which side of the line do you want America to be on, the smart side or the not so smart side. If it's the smart side, then there has to be a commitment to something called the national interest, which transcends partisan politics, which transcends an administration, and which is vital to the successful projection of American military power and to American diplomacy. Finally, as a sort of explanation of my own motives during the course of my post-government career. When I left the State Department in 2003, I was working for Colin Powell. And in my last meeting with Powell, he gave me two pieces of advice. The first piece of advice was don't ever try to come back. And I took that to heart. 27 years was enough. But the second piece of advice he gave me was don't try to look back. And I rejected that advice. And I've spent the last 23 years in what I call the public conversation, trying to figure out why we succeeded when we did and why we failed when we did. And the one lesson, well, actually, there are many lessons, but the most important lesson that I've learned, and it's absolutely vital to the discussion we're about to have about the Israeli-Hamas war and its regional and global implications, is that when we fail, invariably, we failed because we persisted in seeing the world the way we wanted it to be, not the way it was. And let me make something clear. If you only look at the world the way it is, nothing will ever change. But if you only look at the world the way you want it to be, I guarantee you, you will fail every single time. The basis for an effective policy, frankly, be it domestic or foreign, somehow occupies the space between the way the world is and the way you want it to be. And that's a critically important feature of trying to do cruel and unforgiving analysis of a problem, even though that analysis may lead, as it often does, to paralysis. It's absolutely critical that if you want to change the world, you first have to understand it. So let me turn now to the Israel-Hamas war and the global and regional implications. There's absolutely no way, and I would not presume to insult your intelligence, that in a half hour or so, I could even pretend to summarize the complexity and the opacity of this war. There's so many aspects and dimensions of it that we don't understand and don't have accurate information about. But I want to make 6 observations, which I think will give you some sort of analytical framework. And again, I'm not here to sell you on these. My selling days are over. You may agree with some, you may not agree, but they're worthy, I think, at least of consideration. First and foremost, what's happening in the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza and what has happened since October 7th is shaped primarily by the tactics, the strategies, the motives, the ambitions, the goals of the 2 major combatants, that I even have to articulate that as an observation would seem so obvious that it shouldn't bear repeating, but it does. Because the one question I've been asked in the hundreds of interviews I've given since October 7 is, why can't we, whether that pronoun is to encompass the international community, the International Court of Justice, the UN, the G7, the US, why can't we stop this? Why can't we essentially intercede in an effort to make this better? And I fall back on an observation that, again, based on 27 years of working on Middle Eastern issues, and I would argue this applies to other areas of the world too, not just the Middle East, in a conflict in which the 2 parties consider the stakes to be vital, pertaining to their security or even their existence, there are real limitations, very important limitations to the influence and power of external parties to intercede and alter the behavior, the objectives, and the motives of those 2 combatants. And I would say to you, looking at the Middle East, it is littered with the remains of great powers who wrongly believed somehow that their schemes, their dreams, their aspirations, their ambitions could somehow be imposed on smaller ones. There are exceptions when it comes to the United States. Nixon and Kissinger, in the wake of the 1973 war, used pressure and persuasion on both Israel, Syria, and Egypt to bring about a ceasefire within 3 weeks. American diplomacy dominated the landscape, paving the way for what ultimately would be not just 3 disengagement agreements, 2 between Israel and Egypt and 1 between Israel and Syria, but paving the way for what ultimately became Anwar Sadat's historic bid to offer a full treaty of peace to Israel in exchange for the return of 100% of Egyptian territory in the Sinai. Yes, there have been exceptions, but that is not the rule. And the Israeli-Hamas war, because of the death, destruction, and devastation, the traumas to civilians on both sides, and the absence of anything that I would describe to you as bold and risk-ready leadership on the part of the Israeli political establishment, the Palestinian Authority, and certainly the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, has made this conflict less amenable to the persuasions and pressures of outside parties, including, and we can get into this later, Washington's influence. And if the U.S. can't or won't move to influence the behavior of both parties, what influence do you think the international community can have? That's not to say that institutions function as potted plants, but if you look at the agencies and the international actors, from the International Court of Justice and its rulings, to the UN Security Council, UN General Assembly, to the UN Secretary General Special Representative on Sexual Violence, to any of the UN agencies, the World Food Program, UNRWA, Jose Andres World Central Kitchen. On the humanitarian side, you see that these agencies and institutions have far more been constrained by the realities on the ground than they have been able to fashion openings and mechanisms to deal with the conflict. And let me just add a historical footnote here. Our record, and when I say our, I don't just mean the United States, I mean the international community. Our record for interceding in conflicts, let alone our role in preventing in other conflicts and in other situations, mass killing, from the Nazi Holocaust to Cambodia, to Rwanda, to Darfur, to Sudan, to Syria, to Myanmar. The list goes on. And we can have a separate conversation about why we have been unable. And again, I say it is not just the United States here. It's the vaunted international community has been unwilling and or unable to implement responsibility to protect resolutions or to stop genocide and mass killing. Second, even though the actions of the two parties, Israel and Hamas, have dominated the trajectory of this conflict, what happens in Gaza, and it's obvious, doesn't stay in Gaza. A war that has lasted longer than any previous Arab-Israeli conflict, with the exception of the 1982 Israel-Lebanon war, was bound to have an impact far beyond a 363 square kilometer piece of territory known as the Gaza Strip. Those consequences, the regional and global consequences, to date may not have been as disruptive or as transformative as the 2+ year war that is going on, and which was begun by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But there are still serious concerns and issues with respect to the regional situation and the international situation, the global situation, that is critically important. Another historical note, by the way, on length of conflicts. The University of Chicago, together with Uppsala University in Sweden, has done a study of every interstate conflict since 1815. The average length of an interstate conflict between two states, between two countries, between two nations since 1815, the average length is 3 months. If a conflict lasts longer than a year or two, it's likely to go into multi-years. I'll give you Ukraine, Russia-Ukraine, as an example. This one has gone on as of April 7th for 6 months. And right now, I see very little chance, even though the nature of the conflict may change, I see very little chance right now for any quick ushering in of a period of security and stability. We'll return to that in a minute. But as far as the international implications, I would cite 3, and then a 4th, which I may spend a few more minutes trying to amplify. Number 1 is great power competition. The Israel-Hamas war did not start what is clearly a international competition with the U.S. on one side and China and Russia, with the Chinese being the senior partner in the relationship and the Russians being the junior partner. The Israel-Gaza war has only amplified what is clearly an adversarial relationship, let's say, between the international community's three most dominant players right now. And three of those players, Russia, China, the US, sit on the UN Security Council. Russia and Chinese involvement in this war has not been what I would call proactive or interventionist. The Russian-Israeli relations have deteriorated largely over Israeli concerns about Russian support and Iranian support for Russia. And Moscow is only too happy to see any diversion from Ukraine create distractions from Putin's ongoing war of aggression against Kyiv. The Chinese, who are not in favor of a regional escalation because so much of their oil imports come from Saudi Arabia. And I might add here, the US Navy, paradoxically, is probably the single greatest security provider of the export of Saudi Arabian oil to China. But both Russia and China see great opportunity in the continuation of this war. They have both maneuvered relatively adeptly to turn much of the global South, which didn't need much influence in turning, against isolating both Israel, for sure, as a consequence of the exponential rise in Palestinian deaths and the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, but also isolating the United States. And they're very content and happy to see and envision a sort of managed confrontation between Israel and Hamas. The Chinese, far from wanting to end the conflict, have reverted to a policy, it seems to me, of blaming Washington for the continuation of the war. Second is the issue of economic disruption. You know, I'm reminded of the joke about the guy who jumps off the 10th story building. As he's traveling down around the 5th floor, somebody yells out, "How you doing?" And he responds, "So far, so good." So far, so good. The economic implications of this war, particularly when it comes to supply chains, and specifically when it comes to oil, since oil trades in a single market and no economy is immune from disruptions, sustained disruptions. The Egyptian economy, clearly because of the loss of Suez Canal revenues, has taken a big hit. And the Red Sea, a relatively stable body of water with the security threat in the past prone to piracy, has now become an area of conflict where a small Shia sect, Zaydis, have geographically positioned themselves, the Houthis, to disrupt in a significant, serious way global trade through the Bab el-Mandeb, through the Suez Canal. Roughly 30% of all container trade goes through Suez, and about 15% of global trade. The Houthis have not chosen to disrupt oil tankers and the flow of oil. And I suspect they have come to some understanding with the Saudis not to do so. But the Houthis remain a potent force, and it demonstrates once again the asymmetry of power. You've got three naval task forces in the Gulf, in the Red Sea, that have still been unable to staunch Houthi short and long range ballistic missiles and drones. But the situation has not been catastrophic for global supply lines. Traffic through the Red Sea, I think, has fallen by 50%, and traffic in and out of the port of Eilat, which has been struck or attempted to be struck by Houthi long-range missiles, has declined by at least 85%. If, in fact, we were to see a major economic disruption, it would have to be in the oil market. The World Bank cautioned in October that if there was an expansion of this conflict beyond Israel and Gaza, that oil prices could surge to over $150, $150 per barrel. it would be a double, excuse me, a double shock. First, the disruption of the oil market because of Ukraine, and second, the Persian Gulf. But fortunately, we have not yet, this conflict has not yet evolved to what I would describe to as a regional war. I want to take a minute to talk about that, because I think that represents a serious regional and international complication. The third and final global and regional consequence has been the polarization and disinformation that the Israel-Hamas war has produced. And I have to say, never, in my experience, I was at the University of Michigan during the Vietnam War, and I'm not comparing what's transpired here and in Europe to the domestic reaction to Vietnam. But we fought the two longest wars in American history, in Iraq and Afghanistan. Americans were deployed and dying in Iraq and Afghanistan. We were responsible for the deaths of scores of thousands of Iraqis and Afghans in the wake of 9/11. I have never seen any Middle Eastern issue disrupt American political culture and royal domestic politics as the Israel-Hamas war has done, not just on campuses, but in the whole media and political debate. It's a much longer conversation as to why that's occurred, but it's stunning. It really is stunning. And clearly, our already ingrained political dysfunction has been made worse, it seems to me. And I'll make an editorial comment here about university campuses. I'm not going to generalize, and I'm not suggesting that there are unique and common attributes to debating this issue on a university campus. But I am extremely troubled by the fact that thousands of miles away from where this conflict is actually taking place, that Americans, sheltered and insulated from everything Israelis, particularly Palestinians, in the last 6 months have been exposed to, cannot find a way, and I'm referring specifically to Arab and Muslim Americans and Jewish Americans, and Americans generally who have strong feelings on this, who are not, who have no religious affiliation, why it is so hard on a university campus to sit down and have rational civil discussions on this issue. I really don't understand it. I'd like to find a single cause to explain it, but I can't. I really can't. If you can't have these discussions on a university campus, and you can't do it in a way that's respectful and civil, and when I talk about civility, I'm not talking about politeness. It's easy to be polite. I'm talking about civility in the broadest sense of the word, where you are actively listening and trying to really understand to the degree that you can understand, because people are sum totals of their own experiences. You can't deny who you are. But I think you can set aside the prejudgments and prejudices that you have, and even strong views, which may be warranted, to sit and listen with a view toward building bridges, if that's possible, and not walls. It's critically important, it seems to me. And the fact that we can't do it here, or it's not being done in a way that's respectful and civil, makes no sense to me, given the fact that our lives are not on the line. When an Israeli and a Palestinian speak about one another in the worst possible terms, I don't like it, but morally I can accept it, because I know they will suffer the consequences of their views. Here, that is not the case. I put that out there because I think it's one of the important consequences, both regional and international consequence, of the Israel-Hamas war. Let me make another point about escalation. It's my third point out of 6. We do not have a regional war yet. We have 3 theaters: the Israeli-Lebanese border, pro-Iranian strikes against American military assets in Jordan, Iraq, and Syria, and the Houthi campaign against international shipping in the Red Sea. That is not a regional war. But the dangers of Israel-Gaza becoming a regional war are all too real. And when I say regional war, I mean the following. It would probably begin with a dramatic escalation between Israel and Hezbollah across the Israeli-Lebanese border. For 6 months, they've each observed a sort of escalatory threshold. But that could get out of hand. And if it did, and it escalated to the point where Hezbollah was using its 150,000 to 200,000 repository of precision and non-precision guided missiles of varying ranges and lethalities, and the Israelis either preempted or countered with a devastating strike to destroy Lebanese infrastructure, you could see hundreds of Israelis killed and thousands of Lebanese. But what would make it a regional war, and not just a war between Israel and Hezbollah, is the very real possibility of US, Israeli, and Iranian involvement in a regional confrontation. I'm not predicting it, but it's certainly possible. And that war would envision direct strikes on Iranian territory by the Israelis, and it's hard to imagine the US would not be drawn in, and Iran using its ballistic missile inventory to strike Israel and to go after American military assets in the Gulf. I'm not predicting it, but that is the kind of regional war that the Middle East has never experienced. The longer the Israeli-Gaza campaign continues, it carries with it, and again, I'm not inexorably predicting this, but we need to be aware that what happens in Gaza clearly, and that would be the key demonstration, doesn't stay in Gaza. Let me make 3 more observations and then have a discussion and get to your questions. Fourth, the road ahead. The headlines are grim. There is an effort now to reach a limited hostage for prisoner exchange. Those negotiations are going on, and each party is reviewing the other's proposals, even as I'm presenting to you today, which would involve a limited return of hostages, 40, most likely the women, the elderly, and the infirm, in exchange for roughly 700 to 900 Palestinians in Israeli jails, and at least 100 who have either been convicted or charged with killing Israelis. That exchange would be tethered to a 6-week temporary ceasefire in which you could see, for the first time since October 7, a downshift de-escalation and even a temporary ceasefire for 6 weeks, and the prospects of more humanitarian assistance, not dribbling into Gaza, but surging into Gaza. Because without an Israeli-Hamas conflict, international humanitarian organizations would be more inclined not just to become involved, but to be able, reliably and predictably, not just to get humanitarian assistance to Gaza, but to distribute it within Gaza, which has been a critically important challenge and problem. But even if you got that deal, it won't end the conflict. And this is where things become extremely complicated. Hamas will continue to hold the 50 remaining Israelis, primarily civilian males, and members of the Israeli Defense Forces as an insurance policy for the lives of the senior leaders who the Israelis are determined to kill. Yahya Sinwar, his brother Mohammed, and Mohammed Deif, and a withdrawal and comprehensive ceasefire in Gaza. It's hard to imagine the Israelis accepting that. Even if you got a downshift in the scale of Israel's military actions, which I think is now happening, the Israelis may have deployed as many as 100,000 forces in their initial ground campaign. That's now been reduced to 5,000, roughly a brigade. You might see a continued downshift in military activity, but the real question becomes, and why I'm so pessimistic or sober, is the day after. How do you essentially create a set of circumstances where, in fact, Gaza can be secure, stable, and prosperous? The headlines here do not look good, and neither do the trend lines. Hamas will survive as an organization without question. It may not survive as an organized, structured military force, but it will survive as an organization, and it will retain a capacity either through cooptation or intimidation to affect, as it already has affected, a potential governing structure, Palestinian governing structure in Gaza. The Israelis will continue to operate at some level in Gaza. They have already begun work on a 1 kilometer wide buffer zone that will run the entire length, roughly 36 miles of their border with Gaza. And right now, I see very little prospect for the Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas, an 89-year-old Palestinian in the 19th year of a 4-year term, with no credibility on the West Bank, autocratic, nepotistic, and out of touch with the views of most younger Palestinians. I see no way right now, without elections, without some legitimizing agent that will make the Palestinian governance acceptable to the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, as well as millions of Palestinians in the West Bank, which polls suggest support for Abbas is in single digits. And finally, you need a concept in which Gaza first is not Gaza only. You have to tether whatever happens in Gaza to some political horizon that provides hope as well as aspiration to meet Palestinian needs and requirements for statehood. And you have an Israeli government since December of 2022, the most extreme and right-wing in the history of the state of Israel, for whom most of the elements of a different Gaza are anathema. So right now, the day after, the proverbial day after, looks very, very tentative and extremely insecure. You're also going to be left, let's be clear, with two traumatized communities. This war differs from, in my judgment, from any of the other Israeli phases of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let's be clear, this conflict did not begin on October 7th. But on October 7th, it went to a new and unprecedented scale in terms of the suffering and deaths of civilians. And I'm not just talking about the Hamas terror surge and the indiscriminate and willful killing and sadistic torturing, raping, and the taking of hostages. I'm also talking about the Israeli response, the blockade in which nothing got through for several weeks to Gaza for an already suffering population, the air campaign, among the most intense of the 21st century, and the ground campaign, which, even if you don't want to believe the Hamas-controlled Palestinian Ministry of Health, and even if they do not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, you're talking about 17,000 Palestinians. And since the average age in Gaza is below the age of 15. A substantial percentage of those 17,000 were women and children. How does each society cope with that trauma? That's the question that I'm struggling with, and I can't answer with respect to the future. I'm going to make two additional points and then close. Fifth is the broader point. It's not that the world is more dangerous, in my judgment, but it is more complicated. And when it comes to resolving conflict, I mean, my own view right now, as I look out across the world from the U.S. point of view, it's really a world to be managed, perhaps with a view towards resolving some of these problems, but none of the problems that I can see, from what to do about North Korea's existence as a de facto nuclear state, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to what's going to happen to the Russian-Ukrainian war, to what to do about climate, how we cope with the next pandemic. This is a world that so far defies resolution, in the sense that there is a problem out there that can somehow be comprehensively and definitively resolved in a way that normal humans like you and I would say, you know, that one's actually done. And it was resolved in a way that would endure. I can't think of a single problem out there, not a one, that has a definitive or comprehensive solution. And that raises the question of what the U.S. role is in this world that needs to be managed, not resolved. I would argue to you that, yes, foreign policy is extremely important. But as I look on the next decade for my 40-year-old kids, I see the dysfunction at home, which is the thing that troubles me the most, as in many respects much more important than what President Xi decides to do, what Vladimir Putin decides to do, the Iranian nuclear program, the Israeli-Palestinian issue. All these things are critically important to others out there and to the United States. But our own house is broken and dysfunctional in a way it has never been before. And we've been through crises aplenty in this country. Leadership out there is critically important. Leaders who are both great and good, critically important. But leadership here is, I would argue, for us, even more important. And I think you really do need, I'd hate to focus on any single facet of the US government, but the founders created an open invitation to struggle. They created a system of shared and separated powers, largely to avoid the accretion of power by any single individual. They figured if they created a system which the late Edwin Corwin, political scientist, described as an open invitation to struggle, they could somehow diminish and sort of break apart the aggrandizement of power by a man or woman who would ride in on a white horse with a populist wind behind he or she, and an effort to aggrandize power. And it functioned pretty well, it seems to me, on that specific point. But in a way, it's critically important that we have presidents who are willing and able to turn the M in me upside down, so that M becomes a W in we. We need presidents who can rise above their own petty jealousies, their own demons, their own egos, and attach themselves and the system to an idea and an objective that's greater than themselves. You know, the word I is mentioned only once in the US Constitution. Why did the framers and the founders put the pronoun I in the Constitution. It occurs once, maybe twice. They embedded the inaugural oath that the president takes in Article 2. And I don't think it was coincidental. I think they wanted to demonstrate categorically that the office of the presidency, the man and one day the woman who will hold that job, is subordinate to the norms, the institutions, and the objectives of that document, however imperfect it was and still is. That's critically important if we're to manage what goes on outside of the United States and in a credible way manage what transpires here with a view towards solving a lot of the challenges that we face. Finally, let me end, I think, on a more hopeful note. This has not been a very hopeful 30 minutes or so. Let me end with a comment about hope in history. On October 6, 1973, which is a very long time ago, I was in Jerusalem, listening to the sirens wail as Egypt and Syria and Israel would engage in the October War. Then it was the greatest intelligence failure in Israel's history. 2,800 Israeli soldiers were killed, countless numbers of Egyptians and Syrians. And yet, within 6 years of that trauma, I watched Menachem Begin, Anwar Sadat, Jimmy Carter sign a full treaty of Israeli-Egyptian peace on the White House lawn. In that case, trauma turned to hope. 20 years later, I'm sitting on the White House lawn again, September 13th, 1993. That's also a very long time ago. Watching Yasser Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin, and Bill Clinton sign the Declaration of Principles of the Oslo Accords, which are now more or less in tatters. In that case, and yet 20 years later, what remains of Oslo lies broken, battered, and bloody somewhere. But in that case, hope turned to trauma. So what do you make of this? In one case, trauma turns to hope. The other, hope turns to trauma. My takeaway is very simple. You can't see what's in front of you. We can't divine the future. And the arc of history bends in ways that are terrifyingly bad at times, but also surprisingly good at times. And it's up to us, I really do believe, each in our own way, to try to bend the arc of history in a way that resounds to create a situation that strengthens human dignity, human security, and hopefully peace. Let me stop there. Be more than happy. I know, Dr. Josh, you're going to moderate questions. Be more than happy to listen to your comments and answer questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Miller, Mr. Miller, for that very wide-ranging.
No doctors, Josh.
No doctors. I apologize, Mr. Miller, for that very wide-ranging and informative talk about what is going on currently and the international implications. And it was a very sobering discussion, I think, about the challenges that lie ahead, but an important note on hope that you introduced and kind of expecting the unexpected from your personal experience in the region. So that was very, very helpful. I guess I don't want to take too much time. I want to open the floor to questions from our students and the people who are on the call. But I guess, so I have a large question, a small question. I'm going to start with the small question, I guess, about, the path forward in the short term. And, we talked about Israel-Hamas. And, the stated objectives right now of Israel is the destruction of Hamas. And you mentioned before that that's not really a realistic objective. So I guess what I'm asking would be, what what is the objectives and the path forward that we would need to see on the Palestinian and the Israeli side? Do we need to see the current Israeli government, which you described as the most right-wing in history, kind of fall and have a more centrist government under someone like Gantz? Do you need to see, change in the politics on the Palestinian side? Do you need more of a statesman who could move past the traumas that you ably described, actually try to encourage the populations to move past the trauma to come to some recognition that complete destruction of one actor, in spite of the horrors that were visited, might be necessary? So I guess I'll start with that question.
Yeah, I mean, leadership, and thanks for that, because it gets to the core of leadership. And I would argue, some argue it's reductionist. I think it was Marx, not Groucho Marx, the other Marx, writing in the 19th century, and forgive me, he said that men make history, but rarely as they please. Men and women make history, but rarely as they please. So leaders are constrained, let's be clear. But you do need a leader on both sides who are masters of their political houses, not prisoners of their ideologies. Leaders who are essentially acting not because there's external pressure only, but because they both understand that the futures for their nations and their nations' children and for generations to come depend on a much more enlightened pathway forward. You know, someone once said to me that in the history of the world, nobody ever washed a rental car. It's a profound piece of philosophy, but it gets at a critical point. People care only about what they own. It's maybe a sad commentary, but people don't wash a rental car because you don't own it. Why spend the money washing it? That's what's missing, and that's what's been missing for years. The absence of ownership on the part of leaders to literally believe that alternative pathways required, which takes into account the mutual needs and requirements of the so-called other. And my real concern and fear is when this is over, that Israelis and Palestinians are going to look at each other and they're going to say, you know, the problem is not that we don't understand one another. The problem is that we understand one another only too well. And to get over that trauma, that anger, that sense of vengeance is going to require time, but even more so, it's going to require leaders, plural, on each side. Without them, I don't know where we're going to be. And yes, you will need a new government in Israel. There's no question about that. It will be a government, I suspect there will be a course correction. It'll be a government that is more pragmatic when it comes to dealing with the United States. It'll be a government committed to more civility in terms of Israeli internal politics. It'll be a government that takes more seriously the needs of the 2 million out of almost 10 million Israelis, Palestinian Israelis who are citizens of the state, who are guaranteed equality under the Declaration of Independence, but who suffer systematic economic and social discrimination. It'll be a government that is in favor of an independent judiciary. But in the wake of October 7th, going to be a government that is going to be very withholding and very risk averse when it comes to satisfying the needs and requirements of their Palestinian neighbors. And on the Palestinian side, there's got to be a leadership change. And I think it's a huge mountain to climb. Under Arafat, the Palestinian national movement was as united as it had ever been. Arafat controlled most of the guns. There was one negotiating position and one authority. And what's happened with Hamas's emergence in 2007 and the absence of the Palestinian Authority's credibility, partly, obviously, because of Abbas's own style, but also clearly a part a result of the Israelis undermining and disempowering the Palestinian authorities through ongoing settlement policy and land confiscation. But you're going to need a Palestinian national movement that has one gun, one authority, and one negotiating position. We can talk all day long about Israeli transgressions, Israeli settlement policy, land confiscation, the efforts of the current government to pursue policies on the West Bank to annex the West Bank in everything but name only. We can go on, and all of that is very quite legitimate. On the other side, however, in my judgment, the main challenge is to produce a coherent, cohesive national movement that controls all the guns of Palestine, that has one negotiating position, whatever it is, and one authority that's credible and respected. Because without that, it's not one hand clapping. And that's really, really critically important and often ignored. And we can talk about the Israeli occupation all day long. And to some degree, it is responsible for the absence of such an authority. But the Palestinians have agency. And I sense that in the wake of the misery, death and destruction of the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, Hamas is not the answer, nor is the Palestinian Authority. I think in many respects, this has fundamentally transformed maybe Palestinian history. And I think it's its own sort of Nakba, its own catastrophe. And it may wash away much of the traditional agencies and the way Palestinians have looked at their governing structures. And I'm hoping that what will emerge, and it's going to take an enormous amount of support from the Israelis and the international community, will be a more legitimate, cohesive, and legitimized, said that before, Palestinian governing authority. It's just right now on both sides. That's a vision tethered to a galaxy far, far away, rather than the realities back here on planet Earth.
Great. Thank you for that, really informative and in-depth answer. So I have my students. So students, keep in mind, if you have any questions, I want to make sure if students have questions, you have time to reply. I'm going to go to a question from a colleague of mine, professor many of you may have had, Professor Melissa Clapper. While we're going back and forth on this, think about any questions you may have. My colleague, Dr. Clapper asked, Mr. Miller mentioned realities on the ground as important to policymaking and foreign affairs. What are the consequences in a case like the Israel-Hamas war in the competing narratives of what reality even is, or what security would be?
It's a fascinating question, and it's one that I'd have to really, it prompts the need for a thorough discussion of how the respective narratives of Israelis and Palestinians are going to evolve and how they themselves perceive reality. And as I mentioned in 73, there was a countervailing force that was able, both for Egyptians and Israelis, to essentially reshape narratives and create a different context and a different reality. And my great fear is that the course corrective to trauma, to despair, to hopelessness, to Israel's suffering on October 7 and the way Palestinians have suffered during the course of the last 6 months, and hostages have been degraded and suffered, is that you'll need a leader or leaders to begin to help reshape the reality. But more basic is the fundamental need to transform the actual realities on the ground. And this is where it gets extremely complicated. That means creating a new vision, a new reality for Gaza, where 2.3 million Palestinians are not living in an open air prison. It's going to involve an extraordinary amount of healing and psychological counseling and mental rehabilitation there. It's going to require not just humanitarian assistance, but a degree of reconstruction assistance that will require billions of dollars and years, 2 years minimum, I suspect, even to deal with the problem of rubble and mines. And on the Israeli side, you're going to need a new governing reality. And it's hard for me to imagine, since the Middle East, usually when it comes to more positive outcomes, has only two speeds, slow and slower. And there, I think, is the real problem. Time is going to be required for healing, but it's an ally in that respect. But time is also an adversary, because the realities that currently are held by both sides, if they are left to congeal and fester, it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, to create new ones. And it's hard for me to get my mind around a process to make that actually happen.
Great, thank you. I have one more question in the queue. Students, do we have any questions that we would like to pose for Mr. Miller? I see one of my students, Joshua, and maybe I also see Graham in the back. So I might take 2 questions and collect them because we have 10 minutes left. I want to make sure we have the question in the queue. So try to keep it somewhat brief. But yeah, Josh and Graham, why don't you go ahead?
All right. Do you still, I mean, this will be kind of straightforward question. Following this conflict, do you think is like the two-state solution, which the international community has been pushing for, is it still like a viable outcome with all the problems of governance that you've highlighted here? Or do you think at this point, some of the only viable outcomes would be either occupation by, say, neighboring forces like Egypt and Jordan again, or Israel, or the UN tries to come to another resolution to try to merge the states, or whatever it be? Is the two-state solution in your eyes still a viable option?
Yeah, it's a real question, and people can argue and debate. There's compelling arguments that it's too late, that there's no way it can't. I was at the last serious effort to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That was 20 years ago, 23 years ago in July, 24 years ago in July, this July at Camp David, where Bill Clinton brought Arafat, then Ehud Barak, Prime Minister Barak, PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat to Camp David for 14 days to try to resolve the 5 core issues: border security, refugees, Jerusalem, and the end of all conflict and claims, those 5 issues. The gaps by the end of that summit and the second intifada that followed were as wide as the Grand Canyon. And if they can get any wider, they've done so in the intervening 20 plus years. Nonetheless, as I look at the options, every other option, frankly, is worse. A one-state solution, even a one-state solution based on a just one-state solution, in the wake of October 7, strikes me as fantastical. There is no precedent before October 7th in the Middle East, or there may be no precedent in modern history for 2 peoples who have fundamentally different national narratives competing over resources, land, and religious space. The Haram al-Sharif, Har HaBayit, where the noble enclosure is, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Dome of the Rock, that reliquary. Below sits the remains of both Jewish temples. That's overlapping sacred space. We grappled with that at Camp David and obviously couldn't find a solution acceptable to both sides. I don't see how Israelis and Palestinians, even before October 7th, will live happily ever after under one big roof. Cyprus, an example perhaps. Lebanon, I'm not sure Lebanon is a good example. It isn't a good example. So how do you reconcile the needs and the national narratives and the historical wounding and the traumas and the competition over resources, space, and territory and religious space without separation? Separation through negotiation, in my judgment, and I know the group of humans who still ascribe to any hopefulness on a two-state solution is growing smaller and smaller by the day. But it strikes me that the only pathway that deals with the demographic, political, religious, and psychological challenges posed by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is separation through negotiation.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I have I want to make sure we get the 2 questions we have remaining in. We have about 5 minutes. So I'm going to go to my student in the back. I don't try to project loudly so your microphone can pick it up. So my student, Graham. So go ahead, Graham.
Of the 3 world powers who are sort of backing sides on this, whether it be China or Russia or the US, which is most likely, would you say, to maybe withdraw support to either cut their losses, or if it's in the case of Russia, that they may need to focus their attention elsewhere?
Okay, so
Josh, I'm not sure I got all of that. Could you rephrase for me?
so
Sounds like a really good question.
yeah, so I believe Graham's question was, of the 3, you spoke about the international implications with Russia, US, and China. Which of those 3 powers, Graham, I think asked, do you think is most likely to withdraw their supports for some of the powers? Was that kind of capturing your issue? And I guess I would just follow up a little bit on that. You know, at least in domestic American politics, you do see these shifts in the Democratic coalition and, you know, underneath the surface, not really underneath the surface. So how do you see the shifting domestic positions in these countries and who would withdraw or give support to?
Well, I think the Chinese and the Russians don't have in my judgment, the Chinese have the potential to play a major economic role. I don't think they aspire, even if they aspire, I think they're smart enough to understand they don't have the security credentials that the United States has to influence policy, nor do either the Chinese or the Russians have the history, both good and bad, I might add, in terms of an American role in peacemaking. I think the U.S. is key here. I think that along with European partners and any number of countries from the global South, I think you can envision enough of a critical mass on the international side to support a rational solution for Gaza and even a solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, assuming you have the Israeli-Palestinian leaders who are willing to go ahead. As far as Josh, your comment on polarization here, you know, the Biden administration, the president is navigating a very fine line between a Republican Party that has emerged as the Israel can do no wrong party and a deeply divided Democratic Party, many of whose progressives want to impose severe consequences on Israel for its policies, and even mainstream Democrats who are willing to be more outspoken. So what had been a very bipartisan sort of position on Israel has become much more polarized, which frankly has only added to the already increasing polarization between Republicans and Democrats on an issue like Ukraine, which is critically important. You have an emergency supplemental that's still stalled because the Speaker of the House won't introduce it on the floor. Eventually, I think he will, and the $60 billion that Ukraine needs in support will go through. But you're dealing here with a very polarized environment. And I think my earlier comments made that clear.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I want to make sure to get the last question we have in the Q&A. How do you specifically envision a new Palestinian leadership? Do you believe it is genuinely possible to loosen the grip of Hamas and the PA on their respective areas of governance in order to form a new authority? The traumas of Gazans and those in the West Bank are clearly different, and they seem to have sought out different channels of resistance.
It's so true. I'm not sure I have an answer to that question. The most popular Palestinian real leader right now, if you believe Khalil Shikaki's polls, and I do believe him, he's the most, I think, reliable Palestinian pollster, is that Marwan Barghouti, who is former Fatah, now serving 5 lifetime sentences in an Israeli prison for killing 4 Israelis and a Greek national. Barghouti polls highest, certainly triple that of what more than triple what Abbas gets, and even more what Ismail Haniyeh, political leader of Hamas, gets. Now, would the Israelis be willing to release Barghouti? Could Barghouti become the sort of new leader around which young Palestinians bridging the generation gap, and even Palestinians in Gaza? And by the way, the polls in Gaza that Shikaki has conducted have the same results with respect to Barghouti popularity and credibility. If the Israelis let him out of jail, would he diminish in stature because he has to deal with the impossible situation of what it's like to govern under an Israeli occupation? It's a very good question. But I think we have to be as open as we possibly can to the reality that the old style of Palestinian leadership, Hamas on one hand, a Fatah-dominated Palestinian Authority on the other, may not be the wave of the future. Even though I will say flat out, I see very little way right now that you could sideline either Hamas on one hand or the Palestinian Authority on the other, which has become, Palestinian Authority has become the address for the international community, as you know. The only address. So that might have to change as well.
Okay, great. So it is 6:17. I'm not sure. I don't think we have any more time technically, but if anybody, Dr. Lewandowski, will we have time if there was anybody who wanted to have one last question, or should we close it off now? Yeah.
We already, I think, took up the amount of time that we were asked. So I think that's good. I mean,
yeah, great. All right. So, Mr. Miller, thank you. Everybody give him a round of applause for a great talk. Thank you very much for taking your time.
And thank you, Carla and Josh. Thank you. And students, Rowan, thank you. It's tough, but I would borrow a line from the X-Files in terms of how you approach this conflict. Trust no one and try to ferret out for yourself by reading widely, by talking to as many people as possible. We have more access to information than any time in recorded history, and I fear that we are not as well informed as we should be, and we are, I hate to say it, we are lazier than we should be. It takes work to really understand this particular conflict. And it really requires a lot of time and effort to go to and then think it all out for yourself and come to your own conclusion. That's the advice that I would give. And I'd be more than happy to be a resource, Carl and Josh, going forward. If there's anything I can do, please don't hesitate to call.
thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Take care, and it was terrific. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much to everybody for tuning in.
Thank you. Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Take care.